A private restaurant, no windows. Bodyguards in every
She didn't
corner.
look scared.
The most
She looked
dangerous man in
determined.
Chicago was dining
And
in
then he
silence.
saw it.
No one enters that room without authorization. No one.
Please,
But that night,
don't
the door
let my
opened.
mom die.
And it wasn't an enemy. It was a little girl, 7 years old, alone, shivering. She looked him straight in the eyes and raised her wrist. He saw something that froze his blood. What she said next changed him forever. And what he discovered about that girl's mother is something he will never recover from. The private dining room at Marchetti's had no windows. That was why Callum Blackwell preferred it. No angles of exposure. No reflections for someone across the street to study. Just mahogany walls, low amber light, and the kind of silence that money could buy. It was a Tuesday in late November, and Chicago was already freezing. The kind of cold that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Callum sat at the head of a table, set for 4, though only 2 other men occupied the chairs. Dominic Farrow, his consigliere, mid-50s, gray at the temples, methodical as a surgeon, and Leo Hardin, who handled the union contracts on the south side. Both men were speaking in low, careful tones about a port shipment delayed out of Milwaukee. Callum listened without looking at either of them. He held a glass of Barolo between 2 fingers, untouched, and his eyes rested somewhere past the wall, as though he were reading something no one else could see. He was 34 years old, clean shaven. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have belonged to a financial analyst or a federal judge, sharp, composed, revealing nothing. His suit was charcoal, impeccably cut, and there was a small scar just below his left ear that nobody asked about twice. 2 of his men stood near the only entrance. Another waited outside by the elevator. Marchetti's owner knew the protocol. When Mr. Blackwell reserved the private room, the hallway was cleared. The kitchen served without interruption, and no one, no server, no manager, no guest, approached the door without being cleared. So when the door opened without warning, every muscle in the room shifted. Dominic stopped mid-sentence. Leo's hand moved beneath the table. One of the guards stepped forward, reaching for the small figure that had somehow slipped past the corridor unnoticed. But Callum raised 2 fingers. Everyone froze, because it was not a threat. It was a child, a girl, 7, maybe 8 years old. Brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that was falling apart. A coat too thin for the weather, zipped up to her chin. Sneakers with one lace untied. She stood in the doorway with her hands pressed together in front of her like someone about to recite a prayer. She was trembling, but she didn't look away. Her eyes, pale green, wide, unblinking, found Callum's across the length of the room, and she held them there. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was small, steady. "Are you Mr. Blackwell?" The room did not breathe. Callum set down his glass. He studied her the way he studied everything, without rushing, without expression, cataloging details. The redness around her eyes, the way her coat sleeves were pushed up past her wrists, as though they'd been rolled by someone else, a faded hospital bracelet still clinging to her left arm. "Who brought you here?" he asked. His voice was low, unhurried. "No one," she said. "I came by myself." Dominic stood. "I'll handle it." "Sit down," Callum said. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Dominic sat. Callum looked at the girl again. "What's your name?" "Wren," she said. "Wren Hargrove." The name didn't register, not immediately, but something behind it, something in the way she said Hargrove, made the air taste different. "What do you want, Wren?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took 3 steps closer. Then, with the kind of deliberateness that didn't belong to a child her age, she pushed up the sleeve of her left arm. On the inside of her wrist, just below the hospital bracelet, there was a birthmark, crescent-shaped, dark, about the size of a thumbprint. Callum felt the room tilt, because he had the same one, exactly the same shape, same placement, same wrist. He had inherited it from his father, and his father from his. The girl looked at the mark on her skin, then looked at him. "My mom told me," she whispered. That if I ever found someone with the same mark, he might be my dad. She paused. She said to find you. Before she died. The Barolo sat untouched. The port shipment no longer existed. Milwaukee was a word from another language. Callum Blackwell, who had ordered men removed from rooms, who had negotiated with killers and never flinched, who had buried people he once loved without shedding a tear, stared at a 7-year-old girl and could not speak. The next 40 seconds passed in absolute silence. No one moved. The guards looked at each other. Dominic looked at Callum. Leo looked at the floor. Callum looked at the birthmark. Then he said very quietly, "Everyone out." "Callum," Dominic began. Now they filed out without another word. The guards closed the door behind them, and then it was just Callum and the girl, standing 12 feet apart in a private room that suddenly felt enormous. Wren didn't sit. She didn't cry. She stood there with her sleeve still pushed up, her breathing shallow, her chin slightly raised. The posture of someone who had practiced being brave. Callum leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He pressed his hands together, the way he did when he was calculating something. But there was no calculation for this. "Your mother's name?" he said. "Lena," the girl said. "Lena Hargrove." The room changed temperature. Lena. He hadn't spoken that name in 8 years, hadn't allowed it. It had been filed in the part of his memory that was sealed shut, the part that held things too dangerous to revisit. Not dangerous because they threatened him. Dangerous because they made him feel something. Lena Hargrove. 23 when he met her, a graduate student in social work at the University of Chicago, with dark hair and a quiet laugh, and the kind of moral clarity that made him feel like a fraud every time she looked at him. She had known what he was. Not the details, never the details, but the shape of it. She had stayed anyway. For 14 months, she had stayed. And then she left. No letter, no fight. One morning she was there, and that evening she wasn't. Her apartment cleared out. Her phone number disconnected. Her friends, the few he knew, claimed ignorance. She vanished the way people vanish when they don't want to be found. He'd looked for her, quietly, thoroughly, using every resource he had. For 6 months, he'd had people searching, and then he stopped, not because he'd given up, because he understood. She had left to get away from him. He had respected that, the only way he knew how, by never looking again. And now her daughter was standing in front of him, with his birthmark on her wrist and a dead woman's last wish in her mouth. "When?" Callum said. His voice was barely audible. "When did she die?" 19 days ago, Wren said, and then, more quietly, "She was sick for a long time. She didn't tell me how long." Callum closed his eyes. 19 days. Lena had been dead for 19 days, and he hadn't known. Hadn't felt it. The world had just continued, ordinary and indifferent, while the only woman who had ever made him question everything was lowered into the ground. "Who's taking care of you?" he asked. "Mrs. Alderman. She was our neighbor, but she told me yesterday that she can't keep doing it. She said they're going to send me somewhere." Somewhere. Foster care. Wren said it the way you'd say surgery or sentencing, like a word she'd heard adults use when they thought she wasn't listening. Callum opened his eyes. "How did you find me?" For the first time, Wren hesitated. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled a younger version of himself. Maybe a younger version of himself. Maybe 26. Standing outside a cafe on North Clark Street. He was looking at something. Off camera and almost smiling. On the back, in handwriting, he recognized like a wound Lena had written. "Callum Blackwell. If something happens to me, Wren, find him. He'll understand when he sees your wrist. Beneath that, he is not a bad man. He just lives in a bad world." Callum read it twice, then he folded the paper along its original creases and held it in his lap. His hands were steady, his chest was not. "Sit down, Wren," he said. She sat in the chair closest to the door, perched on the edge like a bird. ready to fly. "Are you hungry?" She nodded once. He pressed the intercom on the wall. "Bring a plate. Something simple. And a glass of milk." The kitchen didn't ask questions. While they waited, neither of them spoke. Callum looked at the girl, really looked at her, and began to see the things he'd missed. The shape of her jaw, narrow and precise, the same as his. The way she held her hands when she was thinking. The slight furrow between her brows that mirrored the one he saw in the mirror every morning. And the birthmark. He unbuttoned his left cuff and slowly rolled up his sleeve. He held his wrist out, palm up, without saying a word. Wren stared at it. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. "So it's true," she whispered. Callum didn't answer, but he didn't pull his arm away. The food came. Wren ate like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in a while, carefully but quickly. Callum watched her and felt something moving beneath his ribs that he hadn't felt in so long. He didn't have a name for it. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said, without looking at him, "Are you going to send me away?" The question landed like a bullet. "No," Callum said. He said it before he'd decided, before he'd calculated the risk, the logistics, the exposure, before he'd consulted anyone or considered what it meant. He just said it, and the moment he did, he knew it was the truest thing he'd said in years. Callum made 3 phone calls in the car. The first was to Dominic. "I need a full background on a woman named Lena Hargrove. Last known address in Chicago. She died approximately 3 weeks ago. I need medical records, death certificate, housing history, and the name of whatever attorney handled her affairs. And I need the file on my desk by morning." Dominic, to his credit, didn't ask why. The second call was to a woman named Greta Nolan, a family attorney who had been on retainer for various Blackwell interests for years. She never asked questions either. "I need emergency custodial paperwork drafted for a minor. Her name is Wren Hargrove, 7 years old. I'll have documentation sent to your office within 24 hours. The third call was to the woman named Mrs. Alderman. He got her number from Wren, who recited it from memory, the way children memorize things they know are important. The conversation was brief. Mrs. Alderman sounded exhausted, relieved, and slightly terrified in equal measure. She agreed to bring Wren's things to a location Callum specified. She didn't ask who he was. Something in his voice told her not to. Wren sat in the back seat of the armored sedan beside him, her seatbelt pulled tight across her small frame. She watched the city slide past the window with the quiet intensity of a child who was used to observing, not participating. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't fidget or complain. She simply existed beside him in a silence that felt strangely comfortable. Callum lived in a brownstone in Lincoln Park. 4 stories. Unremarkable from the outside. Fortified on the inside. Security cameras on every approach. Reinforced doors. A panic room on the 2nd floor that was disguised as a linen closet. It was not a home. It was a command center that happened to have a kitchen. He had never imagined a child in it. When they walked in, Wren stopped in the entryway and looked up at the high ceilings, the dark wood, paneling, the staircase that curved upward into shadow. "It's very quiet," she said. "Yes." "Do you live here alone?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, as though confirming something she already suspected. Callum showed her to a guest room on the 2nd floor. It was sparse. A bed, a dresser, a lamp. The sheets were white and unused. The walls were bare. "This is temporary," he said. "We'll get you what you need." Wren walked to the window and looked out at the street below. After a moment, she turned and said, "My mom used to say that temporary is just a word people use when they're scared to say forever." Callum stood in the doorway and said nothing. Because she was right, he left her to sleep, or try to. He walked downstairs to his study, poured a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, and sat in the dark. Lena was dead. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes and let the sentence exist inside him. He let it fill the spaces between his ribs, the hollows behind his lungs. New existed. A 7-year-old girl. With new existed. A 7-year-old girl with his jawline and his birthmark, and his habit of watching before speaking. A girl who had walked into one of the most dangerous rooms in Chicago and held her ground. A girl who ate like she was used to hunger and spoke like she was used to being alone. She was 7, which meant Lena had been pregnant when she left. The realization didn't land all at once. It seeped in, like water through a crack in stone. She hadn't just left to protect herself. She had left to protect the child. His child. She had looked at his world, the money, the violence, the quiet ruthlessness that paid for everything. And she had decided that a fatherless life was safer than a life in his orbit. And she had been right. That was the part that destroyed him. She had been right, and he hated her for it. And he missed her so badly his teeth ached. At 2 in the morning, Callum walked upstairs and stood outside the guest room door. He listened. Inside, he could hear the slow, uneven breathing of a child trying to sleep in an unfamiliar place. He pressed his palm flat against the door and stood there for a long time. Then he went back downstairs, opened his laptop, and began doing something he had not done in almost a decade. He began to plan around someone other than himself. The file arrived at 6 in the morning. Dominic brought it personally, sealed in a black folder, and set it on Callum's desk without a word. He started to leave. "Stay," Callum said. Dominic sat. He folded his hands and waited. Callum opened the file. Lena Hargrove. Born in Rockford, Illinois. Parents deceased. Father from a heart attack when she was 12. Mother from ovarian cancer 3 years later. Raised by an aunt who died the year before Callum met her. She had no siblings, no living relatives, no safety net. She had been entirely alone in the world, and she had never once told him. After leaving Chicago, she had moved to a small town in downstate Illinois, Champaign. She worked as a counselor at a women's shelter for 2 years, then at a school district, then at a community center. She never made more than $42,000 in a single year. She never married. She never changed her name. Ren was born on March 14th, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, delivered at Carl Foundation Hospital. Father listed on the birth certificate, unknown. Callum read that word 3 times. Unknown. She had chosen to erase him. Not out of cruelty. Out of protection. She had built a wall between his world and her daughter's, and she had made it out of silence. The medical records told the rest. Lena had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months ago. By the time they found it, it had already spread. She underwent treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, a brief remission that collapsed. Within weeks, she died at home, in her own bed, with Ren beside her. The hospice nurse's report was included. In her final days, Lena had been lucid. She had organized her paperwork. She had written letters, one to the school, one to Mrs. Alderman, and one to Ren. The letter to Ren was not in the file, but the photograph was, the same one Ren had shown him. Lena had kept it for 8 years, had kept his face in a drawer or a box or a pocket, close enough to find, far enough to survive. Callum closed the file. "The girl," Dominic said carefully. "She's yours?" "Yes." "You're certain?" "Look at her, Dominic." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" "She stays." "Callum, think about what that means." "I've thought about it." "Have you?" "Because the moment anyone knows you have a child, she becomes leverage. She becomes a target. Every enemy you've ever made, every alliance that's ever been strained, they'll know exactly where to aim. Then no, before. She is not to be discussed. Not before. She is not to be discussed. Not with the crews. Not with the partners. Not with anyone outside this room. She doesn't exist in our world. If someone asks, she's the daughter of a friend. If someone presses, they stop asking. If someone becomes a problem, they become my problem. Is that clear?" Dominic studied him for a long time. Then he nodded. Clear. Hey. Good. Now get me a child psychologist. Someone discreet, and find out what second graders need. Supplies, books, whatever. He paused. And Dominic. Yes. Find out where Lena is buried. The first week was a study in mutual bewilderment. Callum Blackwell had managed supply chains worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had navigated federal investigations, territorial disputes, and the particular politics of men who solved disagreements with violence. He had never been confused by logistics, but he did not know how to make a child's lunch. He stood in the kitchen on the second morning, staring at a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter with the focus of a man disarming a device. Wren appeared in the doorway in pajamas that were too short at the ankles. She was growing out of everything she owned, and watched him. You put the peanut butter on both sides, she said. Why? So the jelly doesn't make the bread soggy. He looked at her. She looked back with the calm authority of someone who had been making her own sandwiches for a while. Show me, he said. She did. She stood on a step stool and spread the peanut butter with a butter knife, talking him through it as though she were teaching a class. Callum watched with the kind of attention he usually reserved for reading legal documents. When it was done, she took a bite and nodded. That's correct. He almost smiled. Over the next several days, the brownstone began to shift. Not physically. The walls were the same, the furniture unchanged, but the texture of the place altered. There were sounds now. The soft thud of small feet on hardwood, the murmur of a voice talking to no one, Wren narrating to herself while she drew at the kitchen table, the creak of a bedroom door opening in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep and wandered to the hallway, where she would sit on the top step and listen to the silence until it felt safe enough to go back. Callum knew about the hallway. He'd seen it on the security feed. He didn't say anything, but on the fourth night, he left a blanket on the top step, folded, without a note. In the morning, the blanket was back on the step, refolded. Wren didn't mention it, neither did he. But it became a ritual. Every night the blanket was there. Every morning it came back. Something unspoken passed between them through that square of fabric, something neither of them could have articulated. He enrolled her in a private school on the North Shore under the name Wren Hargrove, no connection to him on paper. The tuition was paid through a trust that couldn't be traced. He hired a driver, a retired Marine named Byrne, who had worked for the family for years and who understood, without being told, that this assignment was the most important one he would ever receive. Wren didn't fight the school. She didn't fight anything. She moved through her new life with the eerie adaptability of a child who had learned early that resistance was a luxury. She ate what was put in front of her. She wore what was provided. She answered when spoken to, and she watched everything. It was the watching that unsettled Callum the most, because it was exactly what he did. On the sixth night, he came home late from a meeting and found her at the kitchen table, drawing. He set his keys down and paused. It's past your bedtime, he said. I know. Then why are you still up? She didn't look up from her drawing. I wanted to make sure you came home. The sentence went through him like voltage. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. She was drawing a house. It had 2 windows, a door, and a chimney with smoke curling out of it. Beside the house stood 2 figures, one tall, one small. They were holding hands. Is that us? He asked. She colored in the chimney smoke without answering. He sat with her until she finished. Then he walked her upstairs, stood outside her door while she changed, and said goodnight. She said goodnight back. It was the most ordinary exchange of his entire life, and it shattered him. Wren noticed everything. She noticed that he never answered his phone in front of her, that certain men came to the house and spoke to him in the hallway with the door closed, that his hands sometimes had scrapes on the knuckles that weren't there the day before, that he owned suits in every shade of gray and black, but nothing with color. She noticed that the house had no photographs. One evening, while Callum was reviewing documents in his study, she appeared in the doorway. She had a habit of doing this, materializing silently, like a thought you didn't realize you were having. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why don't you have any pictures on the walls?" He looked up from his papers. "I never thought about it. My mom had pictures everywhere, of me, of places she went. She said pictures were proof that something happened." Callum set his pen down. She was probably right. "Do you have any proof that things happened to you?" The question was innocent. The weight of it was not. "No," he said. "I suppose I don't." Ren thought about this. Then she said, "I could draw you some, if you want." 2 days later, there were 3 drawings taped to the refrigerator. One was the house with 2 figures. One was a tree with a bird sitting in it. And one was a portrait of Callum, with his hair too tall, and his eyes too big, and his mouth a straight, serious line. Dominic saw the drawings when he came by for a briefing. He stared at them for a long time, but said nothing. It was around this time that Callum began to notice something else. Ren's silences. She talked. She was thoughtful and articulate when she chose to be, but she also went quiet for long stretches, not sulking, not withdrawn, just absent, somewhere inside herself that was private and unreachable. He recognized it because he did the same thing. The child psychologist, Dr. Kaur, came twice a week. She was a small Indian woman with silver-streaked hair and the particular calm of someone who had spent decades sitting with pain. After the 3rd session, she asked to speak with Callum alone. "She's grieving," Dr. Kaur said, "which you already know, but she's doing it in a way that concerns me." "How?" "She's managing it, containing it. She's performing stability because she believes that if she shows you how much she's hurting, you'll decide she's too much trouble and send her away." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "She's a 7-year-old girl who lost her only parent," Dr. Kaur continued, "and instead of falling apart, which she has every right to do, she's holding herself together so that the only other person in her life doesn't leave." Callum was quiet for a long time. "What do I do?" he asked. It was perhaps the first time in his adult life he had asked that question, sincerely. "You let her fall apart," Dr. Kaur said, "and you stay in the room when she does." It happened 3 days later. They were in the car, coming home from school. Byrne was driving. It was raining. A song came on the radio, something soft, acoustic, forgettable. Ren had been looking out the window, and suddenly she wasn't. Her face crumpled, not dramatically, not loudly. It folded inward, like a paper crane being unfolded, and the tears came, without sound. Her small body shook, and she pressed her face into her hands, and a noise came out of her that was so raw and so old that it didn't sound like it could belong to a child. Byrne looked in the rearview mirror, uncertain. Callum didn't hesitate. He unbuckled Ren's seatbelt, pulled her onto his lap, and held her. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't offer comfort in the form of words, because words were useless in the face of this kind of loss. He just held her. She cried for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the dashboard, not because he was impatient, but because he wanted to remember. He wanted proof that this had happened. When she was done, she stayed in his lap, her face pressed into his shoulder, breathing in small, shuddering gulps. The rain streaked down the windows. "I miss her," Ren whispered. "I know," Callum said. His voice was rough. "I miss her too." It was the first time he'd said it out, loud. And it was true. There was a man named Victor Sable. Sable ran a crew out of Bridgeport that had been encroaching on Blackwell territory for months, skimming from construction kickbacks, pressuring a councilman who was supposed to be untouchable, and most recently, making inquiries about Callum's personal life. The kind of inquiries that meant someone was looking for a weakness. Callum had tolerated it, not because he was afraid of Sable. Sable was a mid-level irritant, the kind of man who mistook aggression for power, but because dealing with him would create noise, and noise attracted attention. But then Marcus, one of Callum's younger soldiers, 23, eager to prove himself, made a mistake. During a visit to the brownstone for a routine drop, Marcus caught a glimpse of Ren coming down the stairs. He didn't say anything, He didn't need to. The look on his face was enough. The surprise, the flicker of calculation, the too quick averting of his eyes. Callum noticed. That night, after Wren was asleep, he called Marcus back to the house. "The girl you saw on the stairs," Callum said. "They were standing in the foyer. The lights were dim." "What did you see?" "Nothing." "I didn't see anything, Mr. Blackwell." "That's the correct answer. Now tell me the truth." Marcus swallowed. "I saw a kid coming down the stairs. I didn't think." "You don't think. That's the first thing you need to understand. You don't think about her. You don't talk about her. You don't mention her to anyone. Not your crew, not your girl, not your mother in confession. She doesn't exist. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "If I find out that her existence has traveled past this room, I won't need to find out how. I'll just need to find you. We clear?" "Crystal." Marcus was reassigned to the docks the next day, not as punishment, as distance. But the incident hardened something in Callum. The world he operated in was not theoretical. It was real, and it had teeth. And it would not care that Wren was 7 years old and drew pictures of houses with smoke coming out of the chimney. If she was found, she would be used, and if she was used, he would burn everything to the ground to get her back, and the burning would destroy them both. So he built walls, physical walls. The brownstone was retrofitted with additional security, new cameras, a direct line to a private security firm that operated outside his organization, biometric locks on every exterior door, and invisible walls. Wren's school records were buried under layers of legal insulation. Her medical records were handled by a private physician who made house calls and kept no digital files. Her existence was a secret so tightly held that it became, in Callum's world, the most valuable piece of information he possessed. Dominic managed the logistics with his usual precision, but during one of their late-night briefings, he said something that landed differently than usual. "You know this isn't sustainable." "What isn't?" "Keeping her sealed off from everything. She's not a document, Callum. She's a child. She'll grow up. She'll have friends who want to come over. She'll have questions about why her life looks the way it does. Then we'll deal with that when it comes." "And what about you? You going to keep living 2 lives forever? The boss and the father?" Callum looked at him. "I've always lived 2 lives, Dominic. The only difference now is that one of them matters." It was a Saturday morning in early January, the kind of brittle, blue sky Chicago day where the cold felt personal. Wren had been living in the brownstone for 6 weeks, and the house had changed in ways that were subtle but irreversible. There were books on the living room shelves that hadn't been there before, children's novels, an illustrated encyclopedia of birds, a collection of poems that Dr. Carr had recommended. There were colored pencils in a mason jar on the kitchen counter. There was a small pair of rain boots by the front door. Callum had been up since 4, dealing with a situation involving the Milwaukee port that had finally reached its conclusion. He was tired, the kind of tired that lived in his bones, not his muscles. He was sitting in the kitchen in a white t-shirt and dress pants, drinking coffee when Wren came downstairs. She climbed onto the stool across from him and poured herself a glass of orange juice with the focused seriousness of a chemist. Then she looked at him. Her eyes dropped to his arms. Then his collarbone, where the t-shirt didn't quite cover. Then back to his arms. "You have a lot of scars," she said. He set down his coffee. He knew this conversation was coming. He'd known since the first day. "I do," he said. "Do they hurt?" "Not anymore." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you get them?" He had prepared lies, elegant, airtight lies, a car accident, a construction job in his youth, stories that would satisfy a child and protect her from the truth. But Wren was looking at him with those pale, green eyes, Lena's eyes, and he remembered what Dr. Kaur had said. "She can tell when you're not being honest." Children always can. "Some of them are from fights," he said. "A long time ago." "Did you win?" He almost laughed. "Almost. Most of the time. And the ones you didn't win?" Those are the ones that taught me the most. She considered this. Then she rolled up her own sleeve, the left one, the one with the birthmark, and pointed to a small, pale scar on her elbow. I got this when I fell off my bike, she said. Mom was teaching me. I went too fast and went into the street and fell. She ran so fast to get me. She was more scared than I was. That sounds like her, Callum said quietly. Ren looked at him. You knew my mom? Yes. A long time ago. Were you... She trailed off, searching for the word. Were you friends? He thought about Lena. The way she used to read at the kitchen table with her glasses sliding down her nose. The way she'd argue with him about politics and never back down. The way she smelled like lavender and coffee. The way she left. More than friends, he said. We cared about each other very much. Then why didn't you stay together? There it was. The question he'd been circling like a dark planet since the night she arrived. Because sometimes people leave to protect the people they love, he said. Your mother. She knew that my life was complicated, and she was afraid that being near me would put you in danger. So she left, and she raised you by herself, and she did a better job than I could have ever done. Ren absorbed this in silence. Are you still dangerous? She asked. Callum looked at his daughter, her small face, her serious eyes, her bare feet on the cold kitchen tile, and said the most honest thing he could. Do anyone who tries to hurt you? Yes. She nodded as though this answer made perfect sense. Then she said, Can I have pancakes? And just like that, the world was ordinary again. He stood up and opened the cabinet and found the mix, and she told him how much to pour, and they made pancakes together in the cold morning light, while the city woke up around them. Callum went to Champagne alone. He drove himself, which he hadn't done in years. 2.5 hours south on I-57, through flat, frozen farmland under a white sky. He didn't play music. He didn't call anyone. He drove in silence and let the miles accumulate like a penance. The cemetery was small. A modest place on the edge of town, bordered by a wire fence and a row of bare oaks. He parked on the gravel shoulder and walked the rows until he found it. Lena Marie Hargrove. Beloved mother. 1989 to 2025. 2 words. Beloved mother. That was her summary. That was the public record of a woman who had loved deeply enough to disappear, who had raised a child alone and dying, who had kept a photograph of a dangerous man in a drawer for 8 years because she believed, in spite of everything, that he was not irredeemable. Callum stood at the grave for 45 minutes. He did not cry. He was not sure he knew how anymore, but something inside him pressed against his chest like a fist, and he let it. I didn't know, he said aloud. His breath made clouds in the cold air. I should have known. I should have looked harder. I should have found you. The wind moved through the bare oaks. Nothing answered. She's safe, he said. She's safe, and she's brilliant, and she makes her own sandwiches, and she draws pictures, and she can't sleep in a strange room without a blanket on the stairs. She's yours, Lena. Everything good in her is yours. He pressed his hand flat against the top of the headstone. The granite was freezing. But I'm going to take care of her now. I know you didn't think I could. Maybe you were right. But I'm going to try, not because I owe you, not because I have to. Because I want to. Because she's the only thing in my life that isn't broken. He stayed until his fingers were numb and the sky had turned the color of ash. Then he got in the car and drove back to Chicago. When he walked in the door, Ren was on the living room floor, surrounded by colored pencils and paper. She was drawing something with intense concentration, a bird from the look of it. She didn't look up. Where did you go? She asked. To visit your mother. Now she looked up. Her eyes were wide and careful. Can I go next time? Yes. Promise. I promise. She returned to her drawing, and then, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather, she said, I told Mrs. Core that I think I might start calling you something different. Callum's hand was on the banister. He didn't move. Like what? He asked. She didn't look up. She shaded the wing of the bird with the side of her pencil. Like Dad. The word hung in the air between them. It was the smallest word, the heaviest. Callum gripped the banister because if he didn't, he was not sure his legs would hold him. "Only if you want to," she added quickly. "I want you to call me whatever feels right," he said. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. "Okay." She paused. "Okay, Dad." He stood there for a long time after that. The heating clicked on. The pencil scratched against paper. Outside snow had begun to fall, light, barely visible, dusting the street with something clean. Spring arrived the way it always does in Chicago, reluctantly, in false starts, with cold snaps that felt like betrayal. And then, one morning, a sky so blue and a breeze so warm that the whole city exhaled. Wren had been living with Callum for 4 months. Her room was no longer spare. The walls were covered in drawings, birds, houses, cityscapes seen from her bedroom window, and portraits of people she loved. Her mother appeared in several of them, always smiling, always in yellow, because Wren said that was her favorite color. There was a bookshelf now, filled to capacity, and a rug shaped like a cloud, and a lamp with a paper shade that she'd decorated herself with markers. The house had changed too, not just the child's things, though those were everywhere, like evidence of some joyful invasion, but the quality of the air itself. There was noise now, footsteps and laughter and arguments about bedtime, and the particular sound of someone who lives with you, calling your name from another room. Callum's world had not stopped being what it was. The meetings continued. The phone calls, the quiet, calculated violence that kept everything in place. He was still Callum Blackwell, and the city still feared him. But there were new rules now. He was home for dinner every night by 7, non-negotiable. Dominic had learned to schedule accordingly. There were no meetings at the brownstone after 5 p.m. There were no weapons in any room Wren might enter. And every Sunday morning, every single Sunday, the day belonged to her. They went to the zoo. They went to the Art Institute, where Wren stood in front of the Impressionists for so long that a security guard asked Callum if everything was all right. They walked along the lake, even when it was cold, because Wren liked the way the water sounded. They ate breakfast at a diner on Clark Street, where the waitress started calling her the artist, because Wren always drew on the paper placemats. One Sunday in April, Wren asked to go to a hardware store. "Why?" Callum asked. "I want to paint my room." "What color?" She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "Yellow." Of course, yellow, Lena's color. They went to the hardware store. They stood in the paint aisle for 20 minutes while Wren agonized over shades. She finally chose one called Morning Light. Callum bought brushes, rollers, trays, drop cloths, and painter's tape. He had never painted a room in his life. They painted it together that afternoon. Callum taped the edges. Wren did the rolling, standing on a step stool, tongue between her teeth, applying the paint with the seriousness of a master restorer. They got paint on their clothes, on the floor, on each other. Wren laughed when a drop landed on Callum's forehead. It was the first time he'd heard her really laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a careful laugh, but the full, unguarded, breathless kind that made her whole body shake. It was Lena's laugh. It was an echo from another life, reaching across the years to find him. He wiped the paint from his forehead and looked at his daughter, yellow-streaked and grinning in a room slowly filling with light. And he felt something he had not felt since he was a boy. He felt like he was home. That evening, while Wren's room dried, she fell asleep on the couch with her head on his arm. The television was on, muted, showing something neither of them had been watching. They yelled. Brownstone was quiet. The city hummed outside. Callum sat perfectly still. He listened to her breathe. He counted the breaths, the way he'd once counted threats, carefully, attentively, as though each one was precious. His phone buzzed, a message from Dominic. "The Sable situation requires a meeting, tomorrow at 9. Callum looked at the phone. He looked at Wren. He typed back with one hand, "Reschedule. I'm busy in the morning." Dominic's reply was immediate. "It's urgent," Callum typed. "She has a school thing. I'll be there." There was a pause. Then, "Understood." He set the phone down and returned to the silence. The yellow paint smell drifted from upstairs, fresh and clean, like a room that had never been lived in before. Like a beginning. Wren stirred in her sleep. Her hand found his arm and held on. The way children do when they're dreaming. Instinctively, without thought, as though proximity to safety is something the body knows before the mind does. He didn't move. He didn't want to. Outside, the last light of the day was fading over Chicago, turning the sky gold, and then amber, and then the deep, bruised blue of evening. A city full of danger, and ambition, and relentless, grinding motion. And in one brownstone in Lincoln Park, behind reinforced doors and biometric locks, and walls built to keep the world out, a man who had never planned to be a father sat on a couch with yellow paint in his hair, listening to his daughter breathe. He was not a good man. He knew that. He would never be a good man. Not by any measure the world would accept, but he was her father, and that, he had decided, was enough. On the refrigerator, among the drawings, there was a new one, taped up that morning before school. It showed two figures standing in front of a yellow house. The tall one had a straight, serious mouth. The small one was smiling. Between them, in Wren's careful, uneven handwriting, was a single word. Dad. And that was all the proof he needed that something had happened.